Uncle Dan.
Hey!
If you're like me, and you're like
And
most people, you're very much like me. In fact, we're practically the same. You've probably, of an afternoon, found yourself down to IKEA.
Ugh.
Yeah, where first of all, it's going to be a controversial take, but I do like the meatballs. I'm going to say it.
Well,
what?
fine.
So good.
The secret ingredient is air.
Well, I like an airy meatball. You know me.
All
But
right.
anyway,
Arian, Mark, Arian.
Oh,
Well, it's both. It's both.
We got off track. So, but what I find is you make a purchase, you take it home, and if you don't use the little doohickey to tighten the proper thing the right way in the Flurgavenflieben, then you can end up with an unstable piece of furniture, right? And you can have a thing that looks sturdy and you thought was sturdy and maybe you paid too much for, but at the end of the day, it's just a fucking lie and it's going to collapse.
I got news for you. Even if you use the Flurgenflaben correctly, it's still going to fall apart.
It's going to fall apart, and it's all it's like particle board and lies, Doug. What do you have to say about that?
And it's IKEA, so you didn't pay too much for it. Don't worry.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I would also like to talk about some flimsy furnishings, I suppose.
Yeah, it's the flimsy furnishing hour.
Well, dear uncles, like many of our listeners, and of course you too, I have been running out of things to do and watch during quarantine to keep my sanity. So after having found the far end of both Netflix and Pornhub, and after giving HBO Max a quick look before deciding that no one's that desperate, I have been doing a lot of introspection. You know what happens when you get to the end of Netflix? It's like Metroid. It just starts over. It's very frustrating.
There's you don't win anything.
Yeah.
Nope.
It's a Mobius strip.
Yeah.
Although when you get to the end of Pornhub, a lot of things happen.
Yeah.
I'm not saying good things, but boy, do they happen.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, mostly because I am 1/3 of an atheist podcast, is my journey out of religion. We all have our own version of that journey. No matter where we started, one way or another, each of us found our way out or managed to steer clear of repressive religious experiences. So today I thought I would reflect on the signpost that eventually helped me find my way into the light. And for your sins, I thought I would bring you all along for the ride. So if you're not interested in some full-fledged navel-gazing, skip forward 20 minutes or so to spare yourself.
Yeah, well, you don't even need us here, do you?
No, please go.
Yeah, all right, bye.
For the dozen or so listeners still with us, let's talk about myself. Let's talk about my shelf, not just myself. The analogy of the shelf is...
the shelf of self.
That's right.
Yeah.
The analogy of the shelf is probably not unique to Mormonism, and I'm not even certain where it truly originated, but the idea is analogous to the straw that broke the camel's back, as I'll explain. In Mormon culture, it originates with an article in the soon-to-be-canceled Mormon magazine Ensign in 1975, where wife of the then prophet Camilla Kimball spun a metaphor for young Mormons on how to avoid having doubts overcome their faith. In the metaphor, when she read or heard things that bothered her about the church, she put them on a shelf in her mind and stopped thinking about them. From time to time.
It's turned it off.
Isn't that nice? Turn it off.
Literally, it's the precursor. Like, I don't know if those Book of Mormon boys knew how spot on they were hitting it, but yeah, I mean, if
it's crazy how spot on they hit it with that shit. It's
exactly.
It's amazing.
Just turn it off.
Yep.
So from time to time, she would look at the things on that shelf in her mind. Some were answered or resolved. Some were no longer important. And some needed to stay on the shelf a little while longer. It's not hard to see how problematic this metaphor is. In what will become a theme of this segment, nothing speaks clearer to the corruption at the heart of Mormonism and all religion than its constant injunction on not only reading and hearing negative information, but from even thinking about it.
Yeah.
At some point, the ex-Mormon community began using this metaphor by running it to its logical conclusion. All of us who escaped from the cult heard, read, or thought things that troubled us about the church, and unconsciously we put those things on a shelf in the back of our mind. Finally, one day, the shelf can no longer take the strain, and it collapsed. It bears mentioning that the shelf oftentimes collapses of the aggregate weight. So many times the final straw may be minor or even seemingly meaningless, but it collapses the whole shelf nonetheless, a la the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
Sure.
And once the shelf is broken, there is no putting Elder Dumpty back together again. So In the process of in order to process the realization that you have been lied to by people you trusted for your entire life, many ex-Mormons, myself included, spend a lot of time, sometimes the rest of your life, examining every piece that you put up on that shelf before it collapsed. So today I would like to talk about a handful of those things from my life. Don't worry, I won't talk about all of them. I don't hate you all that much. So let's go back to the first one I can remember and work our way forward in time to the final one, shall we?
Yeah, it's shelf singular, Doug. It's not shelves. Yeah.
As you all know, all three of us were born into the Mormon faith, and try as I might, I can't remember anyone ever asking me if I wanted it. And so I underwent the indoctrination of having abhorrent and silly stories fed to my developing brain that would be scoffed at if they were told to an adult. Now, before we get going, Uncle Mark is going to feature prominently in this journey as he was either present or central to many of these memories.
Oh, jeez.
So lest any of you think that Uncle Mark is either kind, noble, or knowing, let me just put some context on the kind of person I was forced to grow up with. Across the street from
moving on. Thanks, everybody. Good show.
So glad I'm not your real brother.
Let's wrap this up.
Across the street from our modest home, there was an elderly widow named Bee. She was kindly and sweet, although we did not know her well. She was always quick with a smile and a wave, yet being an elderly widow, she did not offer much by way of drama or adventure to our neighborhood. That was until one day. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, so Uncle Mark was in his early teens.
This is not an important story?
Ever vigilant.
Wait, Uncle Mark, I'm going to overrule you. This is very important. We got to hear it.
I was probably 13 or 14.
Yep, ever the vigilant neighbor, Uncle Mark spotted a suspicious car parked for some length of time in front of Bee's house.
Like, you have to understand, nothing fucking happened in our neighborhood. Ever. So, like, a mysterious car parking was like the Hindenburg crash. You paid attention to.
None of that will exonerate you. Concerned for her safety, lest some gang of violent criminals had taken her hostage in her own home, Mark did what any brave American would do. He told his 8-year-old brother to take his little red wagon to her house under the guise of a newspaper drive for his Boy Scout troop. For those of you under 40, a newspaper was something we all used to read to protect our democracy. A democracy is a form of representative government where the majority gets to pick its leaders. Anyway.
We don't have time, Doug. Move on. We don't have time for all of this.
A newspaper drive, for those who don't know, is where Boy or Girl Scouts would go house to house in their neighborhood and collect the accumulated newspapers from their neighbors to take them to the recycler to raise what meager funds they could to afford Pinewood Derby cars because your uncles grew up in a Norman Rockwell painting. So off I went to do battle with the Sinaloa cartel while Mark watched bravely from behind the curtains in the front window. Now,
somebody had to keep an eye. Somebody had to be the lookout.
Imagine you're an aging widow. Your kids have gone. You're all alone. One of the only outlets you have to interact with the world is the several newspapers you get on a daily basis delivered to your home. You hadn't noticed how full your garage was getting with stacks and stacks of yellowing, dusty news until you could barely shut the garage door anymore. Your tired, gnarled hands could no longer tie string anymore, so the neat, orderly stacks had given way to teetering piles of loose paper.
Look, I'd never seen in her garage. I didn't realize she was a hoarder.
Then, like a miracle, a little tow-headed boy with a rickety red wagon appears at your door to solve all your problems. The shocked look on his face when you opened the door to the vault at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark was priceless. Surely it was the look of regatta boats and a nice new khaki cravat for his uniform, and not the look of catastrophic backfire. And so began the Herculean task of transporting 50 years of pulp history back and forth across the street, one wagon load at a time. Faithful to his calling, Uncle Mark bravely refused to abandon his post at the window, lest some other evil befall Bee, so he watched his little brother toil in the summer heat for the rest of the day.
I didn't want her to be set by highwaymen or brigands.
He also did not take the blame for the driveway full of unwanted and useless newspapers when our parents got home, and luckily Bee never noticed the suspiciously full garbage cans out front of our house for the next several months. So that's who our Uncle Mark is. Just bear that in mind.
Well, I was trying to overload your shelf.
Back to the actual story. The first time I ever felt that there was something wrong with the church that I was forced to attend every Sunday was during a fast and testimony meeting. We've said often on this show that fast and testimony meeting is like an open mic night in a comedy club for divorced men.
Yeah.
It's sad and it is lengthy. Anyone
And
who wants...
there will be weeping.
That's right.
And you don't get to eat beforehand. So
Yes.
you're hungry and you're confused and mad.
You're ignorant and ornery.
The world's worst comedy club. There's no drinking, no nachos.
And no comedy.
No comedy. Anyone who wanted to could get up and talk about pretty much whatever they want. And you guys remember this. It was a common practice for parents to have their very young children get up and bear their testimony. Mm-hmm. These parents would stand behind the children and whisper in their ear, and the children would repeat, I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and I know the Book of Mormon is true. If it sounds creepy, it was.
Yeah.
I believe I was a deacon at the time, so I was around 12 years old, and I watched this display one Sunday with a sense of deep unease. And I remember one word that popped into my head, Nazi. Now, I'm not trying to compare anyone with Nazis. It's just what popped into my head. I think that like all young boys, I was going through my World War II phase.
Yeah.
And the only context I had for that kind of nefarious manipulation was the Nazis I saw in countless documentaries. So I am sure those parents loved their children and thought they were doing the righteous thing there, but it really bothered me. Not knowing what to do with that emotion, I put it on the shelf. Growing up at about 14, for reasons that would become clear, Uncle Mark had just about enough of the Mormon Church. So against tremendous and often violent pressure, Mark stopped going.
Yeah.
As I hit my early teens, having a brother under the same roof who was not a part of the cult was equal parts tragedy and opportunity. I was convinced that Uncle Mark was one story, one scripture, one earnest testimony from returning to the fold, and so I never missed an opportunity to read him scriptures, try out apologetics, and tell him how special the church was.
It was a great time. I loved it.
Looking back, I sometimes marvel at the patience it took to put up with me, but then I remember the newspapers, and I wish I had been even more annoying. One day in church...
We saved that woman's life. Mysterious car.
One day in church, we read the story of Ammon in the Book of Alma, the longest and by definition worst book in the Book of Mormon. The story is too stupid to spend much time on here, so here's the Reader's Digest version. Ammon, a white guy, and therefore righteous, went on a mission to the land of the Darkies, who were therefore evil. He took a job tending the flocks of one of the kings of the land, and while doing so was set upon by a whole band of dark-skinned devils. Ammon not only fought off the Lamanite horde, but cut off so many of their arms, they filled several bags, which were shown to the king, who in gratitude allowed Ammon to preach his gospel to them. Great story.
Yeah.
Mark and I and kind of all our friend circles, we were at the time reading the Dune books and playing D&D. So I was convinced that this hardcore action story would be just the thing. So I read it to Mark in my best baritone. To my surprise and disappointment, it had, let's say, a less than enthusiastic reaction. So,
Oh, Mark. Come on, man.
ditto the time that I've told this story before, so I won't dwell on it, but when I learned the apologetic in seminary about how no one could have made up all the names in the Book of Mormon. No one person. I took that, nice pointy apologetic to Mark, and he's like, okay, time me. Blomho, Blomhoha, Schillingdot.
I think I'd gotten to like 50 just, Yamahihu.
Yeah.
And you just walked out of the room.
I did. I was so
You should
deflated.
have chased him out. Bullshit on.
Yeah.
Clapdoor.
Yeah.
Chandok.
I figured these were such fucking silver bullets that when they just failed, it did make me believe maybe there wasn't all there was to this story. I better put that on the shelf.
Put it on the shelf. Shelf it.
As I entered my middle teens, I began taking more advanced classes in school, and one of them was physics, where we learned about the speed of light. The idea that there is a universal speed limit that all matter must obey was pretty mind-blowing. All the more so because there is a Mormon doctrine that states that God created and is subject to the laws of the universe, which would have to include the speed of light.
I was going to ask you if you were going to bring up this story.
This one definitely stuck in me because it's not that got me. It's the next thing that happened.
Yeah.
This sent my adolescent brain a-spinning. If God lives on or near a star Kolob, and the nearest star to us is Proxima Centauri, which is 4 light years away, any revelation or visitation by God would require him to send that revelation or his visiting angel at least 4 years in advance. Earlier still, the further Kolob is from us. Yeah. So that actually didn't cause me to doubt as much as me trying to wrap my head around how this system would work. I brought this up to a good friend of mine at the time, and after a few minutes of talking about it, he said, and I remember this, we shouldn't be talking about this.
You guys, you flew too close to the sun on that one.
Exactly, and that did cause doubt. Like, why should we not talk about this? What's the danger?
Yeah.
The answer, obvious to us now, but I still believed at the time, so I couldn't see it. So, plunk on the shelf.
Yeah.
I managed to keep my shelf intact long enough to end up on a Mormon mission in Honduras. I've described enough of my sufferings in previous episodes, and Uncle Mark was kind enough to remind us all of my, let's say, less than woke worldview in a letter from me he read in the patrons only section. Hashtag it's never too late to become a patron. I've also described that while on my mission, I was bothered by the fact that while ostensibly sent to serve our fellow humans, we did little to no actual service. I could not understand why the church would not avail itself of the tens of thousands of able-bodied young men and women to effect actual change in the world. Surely such service would do more than anything else to attract people to our message. Nope. Nobody up the chain was concerned, what you did to help a family or a community. It was, how many first discussions did you give? How many challenges did you give? How many books of Mormon did you leave behind a dumpster? That's all they cared about, and it bothered me.
Yeah,
on the shelf,
they just wanted points on the board.
There's points on the board, stats.
Yeah.
So threw that on the shelf. I didn't know it, but the shelf was starting to creak. When I got home, I moved in with a group of returned missionaries and started attending the University of Utah. It's hard to describe how socially maladjusted you are after serving a mission. So the only people you can kind of relate to are other ex-missionaries.
Yeah, it's kind of like guys coming home from Nam, right?
Yes.
They just hang out at the VFW because nobody else gets it.
Right.
Yeah.
So having been dumped on my mission, my prime directive was to find and marry a wife with all possible haste. To that end, unmarried Mormons in college attend what's called a singles ward. It's all the unmarried Mormons in their early 20s desperately trying to get married before they turn 24 and it's too late. If you've ever wondered what the desperate sound of settling for anything was, poke your head into a singles ward. And what's so crazy is you'd see, very good-looking men, very beautiful women, like they're in their, early mid-20s. They will marry anybody. They have got to get married. You know what I mean? Like, it's pretty sad. So I hated it, but I still went. So it was around this time that I began reading The Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Talk about the strangest thing to finally collapse your shelf. I can't even remember if it was for a class or I was just reading it.
I was going to say, who let you read that book in that condition?
Well, I think I just was reading old science fiction. I can't even remember if it was for a class.
Huh.
But like I mentioned, you never know what's going to do it. If you haven't read the book, it's about a dystopian future where all humans are genetically engineered and their fates are predetermined. The rulers of the world are called the Alphas, and they adhere to a very bizarre religion that worships Henry Ford. One of the rituals of this religion is to work Alphas up into a frenzy with song and chant, calling upon Henry Ford to appear, culminating in an ecstatic orgy.
I forgot about the Henry Ford angle.
Yeah, remember that?
I don't know why I forgot that, yeah.
As the Alphas in this one scene begin to get spun up in their ritual, they begin to claim they can hear Ford coming down the hallway. He's right outside. I can hear him. The main character, Bernard, gets in on the action, and he's like, I can hear him too. He's right outside. Even though he couldn't hear him, and he knew he wasn't outside. He was just doing what he was supposed to do and what everyone expected him to do. I think Aldous Huxley was commenting on the dangers of technology, blind obedience to a system, and the evils of totalitarianism. I doubt he was writing his book to help one white kid in Salt Lake City escape from a cult, but there it was.
Well, then not a wasted effort on Huxley's part.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
For how long, I can't say, but for some time I had been utterly faking it. Going through the motions, saying what was expected of me, but deep down, I didn't believe any of it. This was pretty earth-shattering, especially because I had just spent 2 years selling this bullshit and paying for the privilege, by the way. So I decided to give it one more try.
Can I interrupt you really quick, Doug?
Yeah.
Ivana, one of our patrons, our dear friends, was asking about, like, when I did the segment on when I did the patrons only thing about how much our parents stole. She was asking if you paid for the mission yourself or if they did. I couldn't remember.
I paid for a large portion of it. I don't know if you remember that summer and some previous summer, I did a ton of lifeguarding and private swimming lessons, and that was I saved up all that money for my mission. I couldn't pay for all of it though, so.
But it was a lot of your money. Okay, that's so
we
cleared that up for her.
Well,
Sorry to
let me phrase it. It was all of my money, but it was not nearly enough to pay for the mission.
Right.
Yeah. So, I started to give it one more try, and I asked to meet with my stake president, which for Nevermose is like a Catholic bishop, to express my doubts. It was not easy to bring this stuff up. It's really intimidating to go into that room and say that kind of thing. It's such almost expressing a weakness. So, you know, I had this belief still at that time that the further up you went in the food chain in the Mormon hierarchy, the more you knew, the more answers you had,
the more keys to the kingdom you had.
Yeah, the more truth had been revealed to you.
And the more the more close you are to God. So like God will tell you, like he'll whisper in in that stake president's ear more than the bishop's ear, but you know, if you have to go all the way up to the top of the food chain, you probably should have.
Right. Well, I told this guy I was having serious doubts about pretty much the entire Mormon enterprise. And after listening with kind of a bored indifference, he told me to. Any guesses?
Put it out of your mind.
Put it on your shelf.
Go.
Go pray.
No, he said, go home and pray and read the scriptures.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Go shelf yourself.
That was the moment. Like Colonel Kurtz said in Apocalypse Now, and then I realized like I was shot with a diamond bullet right through my forehead. I realized he didn't know the answers because there were no answers. Yeah. It was fake. It was a lie. My shelf collapsed in the lobby of that goddamn church.
Wow.
Ironically, it reminded me of something else from Brave New World. Towards the end of the book, the main characters confront one of the 10 alphas who run the entire world and administer this global religion. And he admits to them that the religion is total bullshit. He knows it. The other 9 know it. But the system must go on. I wonder how many Mormons above a certain level in the hierarchy fully know that it's complete bunk. And they just keep on perpetuating it.
Once you get to a certain level, you kind of have to, don't you think?
I would think, especially like if you're an apostle and you know about the peepstone or the $100 billion. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, and also not for nothing, but like, God ain't talking to you. Like once you get to a certain point, God's supposed to like be telling you shit.
Yeah, there's the combination of the sunk cost fallacy, and I think that, and I don't know what this is named exactly, but I think there comes a moment in some of those minds, Doug, where they go from believing it's true to needing it to be true, and they don't really realize that they've transitioned into kind of a space of doubt, right? I guess that's just a greater extension of the sunk cost fallacy, because John Dehlin had probably his most fascinating interview he's ever done is the Australian or English guy who went to get his second anointing. Yeah. And he was a pretty high-ranking Mormon in his community, right?
Yeah, he was a high 70s or something like that.
Yeah, so he was in the top, hundreds of the Mormon church. And he believed hook, fucking line, and sinker, and his shelf didn't break until the next morning when he walked into the temple and they said Jesus couldn't be here to meet you in person today. Because that's what they tell you is going to happen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's some evidence that I think there's, obviously it's varied, but that's some evidence that there are people who are 100% in, even near the top.
Sure.
I don't know, we'll never know how many upper echelon members of any faith are still true believers. The anecdotal evidence in the Catholic Church that the instances of atheism amongst priests is actually quite high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's because you get to a point where it's like there is no answer. And the only explanation is there's no one to give it. There's no one up there. So, yeah, I mean, I went home that night and very carefully brought this up with my ex-missionary roommates because, again, expressing this kind of sentiment can be really dangerous. It turned out that all 3 of us were in pretty much the same place. We stayed up all night talking, and when the sun came up, we were all out.
Wow.
So it happens fast, at least it did for me. And then, I had to set about finding community and other people to talk to. I basically had to walk away from my social circles. And because I tried to go back to church a few more times out of habit, basically. You know what I mean? All my friends were there. Some of the girls I was interested in were there. And I felt like the last true human in that last scene in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where they're going to find out.
Yeah,
right?
Just don't make eye contact, no sudden moves, just be cool.
But, I did find community, I did find friends, and what we're doing here is definitely trying to help build that community for people in similar circumstances. And then, to kind of round this out, I guess the point of all this is every religious person we know, and any of us know who is still fully invested in a religion has a shelf.
Yeah.
They all do. And many of them can make it through life without that shelf collapsing. But many of them can't. And you never really know if it's going to be just a little feather that finally is just too much for the shelf to take. And so if you can plant a seed, if you can give a doubt, if you can respond to an apologetic, it may not happen now, but boy, it's going to help.
Yeah,
interesting.
And like you were saying, Doug, you were still going through the motions for a while without fully realizing your shelf had collapsed.
Yeah.
So you may be, and it may be people in those circumstances that are really argumentative because they're just realizing that they're in free fall at this point, right? So they,
Right.
you just never know where somebody's journey is, but that's pretty interesting.
So
I just like the image of this podcast being a party that's dancing on the remains of broken shelves everywhere.
Let's have a shelf party.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely what this proves is that if you teach your younger siblings the value of work by having them get 400 tons of newspaper from the weird lady's place across the street, then eventually you'll have a podcast.
Look, all I'm doing by telling that story, Mark, is baring my teeth. You think there's not more? You think the well isn't deep?
There's plenty more. Like the time that you were dancing in the living room when you were like 6 years old and our dad walked by and he just looked in the living room and you stopped and said, sorry. And he walked away.
Oh.
And he walked away and you looked at me and you said, I don't want him to think I'm gay.
Oh, shit.
Well, I was not wrong.
No, your instincts were correct. So, all right. Well, everybody, go put some pressure on everybody's shelves.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on.